Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining GoRail in partnership with the National League of Cities today for our webinar, Building Better Partnerships, Rail Partnerships, Tips for Collaborating with Railroads. I'm Betsy Cantwell, Vice President of GoRail, and I'm joined in moderating today's discussion by Brett Sebastian, our National Field Director. At GoRail, we work with community leaders across the country to build grassroots support for freight rail and advocate for policies that strengthen this essential infrastructure. Over the last 20 years, our state directors have had over 45,000 meetings with community leaders like yourselves, because railroads connect communities and help drive local economies all across the country. And they do it while reducing highway congestion, emissions, and taxpayer burden. That's why we believe in proactive and collaborative relationships with railroads and communities. In case you missed them, we recently hosted webinar sessions on the Federal Rail Policy Outlook and the FRA's National Railroad Partnership Program. And today we're exploring how to build practical, productive relationships with railroads that operate in your communities. We're excited to be joined for this topic by the NLC, which GoRail works with as a strategic partner. And of course, we're also excited to be joined by a very well-rounded panel of railroad representatives who lead community engagement and public affairs efforts across the country. Thank you to Kevin, Cassie, Johan, Tom, Larry, and Curtis for being here. So before we start, just a couple of housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded and will be shared afterward. And then to guide our discussion today and be as responsive as possible, we looked at all the questions that you submitted when you registered, and we combined them into a few topics. So time allowing, we'll still have a Q&A at the end. So please go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A or chat features. All right, so let's get started. I want to kick us off by asking each of you to introduce yourselves and describe your role at your railroad, and how does your railroad approach community partnership and engagement? So let's, I'll kick it off with Kevin.
Everyone, good afternoon. Kevin Donahue, CN, State and Local Affairs Manager. I've been with the railroad 3 years now. Before that, I did a 10-year stint with the state of Illinois, and I was also an elected official, local elected official for 2 terms in Blue Island, Illinois. So I have a little understanding of local government, but I have a deep respect for everything you do for your communities. And happy to be here. Happy to talk about and answer some of the questions you have. For those not familiar, CN, we operate in 16 states across the United States and into Canada. For CN, I cover Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. I'll turn it over to Betsy to hear from the rest of the great panel.
I'm just going to go around my screen. So next I have Larry Lloyd.
Thanks, Betsy. So good afternoon, everybody. Larry Lloyd. I'm the head of U.S. Government Affairs for CPKC Railroad. Much like Kevin and CN, we operate in about 17 states across the U.S. I've got 3 people on my team who mainly are focused on state and local government affairs. So if you're certainly from Texas up the spine of the Mississippi through Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, North Dakota, you probably know those folks really well. And if you need points of contact, happy to share that. I actually worked for CN for a couple of years before I went to CPKC. And then before that, I worked for about 8 years for GoRail. So spent a lot of time with, I think, a good number of people that are on this call, meeting with local communities and really trying to understand some of those friction points where when the railroad operates through there. And I would say in terms of our approach to community government affairs, it really is just striving to be a good neighbor. It's not always easy to have a railroad as a neighbor. And so we certainly want to, one, make sure you have a good point of contact to be responsive when you have questions or concerns on it. And then I'd say a big part of our job is also educating folks on why the railroad is doing what it's doing, from train horn blowing to, operating across a crossing, economic development. There's a laundry list of different areas, but we want to make sure we're being, one, responsive to folks, but 2, also helping educate that folks understand why we're doing what we're doing, whether from just an efficiency standpoint or government regulatory standpoint. I'd say that's a key aspect for us. So with that, Betsy, back to you.
Thanks, Larry. Let's see, Cassie?
Hi, Cassie Gauger. I'm the Senior Director of Industry and Public Projects. So I bring a little bit different perspective relative to more of the public affairs, government affairs perspective, although my team does work directly with those two departments here at UP. So what I handle, my team handles any third-party project that wants to come onto our property to do any sort of work, mainly focused on crossings, right? Any road crossing, any grade separation. Um, my team works to get those projects implemented. And so we have 23 states west of the Mississippi here at Union Pacific.
Thanks, Cassie. Johan is next.
Thank you, Betsy. My name is Johan Hellman. I'm the Executive Director of Public Affairs for BNSF in the Pacific Northwest. I cover Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. BNSF nationally covers 28 Western states. We have about 32,500 miles of track going through hundreds, probably thousands of communities. So it's a really large network. Before coming to BNSF about 12 years ago, I worked for an association representing public ports, which are actually statutorily treated as municipalities in Washington state. So I actually have some professional experience representing and working closely with municipalities. I also served as a legislative staffer in both the House and Senate in Washington earlier in my career. And I worked for a major telecommunications company in a similar position to what I have now. So most of my career, I've gone back and forth between the public and private sectors, which gives a fairly well-rounded approach to these kinds of issues dealing with municipalities. So really excited for the conversation today. I enjoy working with local communities and municipal governments. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Johan. Curtis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Curtis Sloan. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Sustainability at Watco Companies. And so I do state government relations in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia. I'm based in DC and also do a good bit of our outreach here on Capitol Hill. And then the other half of my job is helping build a sustainability portfolio for our short lines. For those of you not familiar with Watco, we're the second largest holding company of short line railroads. And for those of you not familiar with the term short line, there are the big class 1 railroads, like my colleagues represent here on this call. And then short lines cover everything from 2 miles of track and 2 employees to the largest railroad in the state of Wisconsin is actually a short line railroad, largest in terms of track miles. It's kind of a revenue threshold set by the regulator, but we're all sorts of small railroads. So at Watco, we have 47 railroads in the US with 1 in Canada and then a couple in Australia. We also have a division that owns or operates at 80 different terminals and ports around the country. And then we have a third-party logistics division as well that just kind of solves problems for customers. We need to get something from A to B and we need your help doing it. So we have a little bit of everything there. Consistent with being an amalgam of smaller companies and also someone who does more than railroads, our approach to community relations and government affairs is kind of a hodgepodge, right? We have a team of 5 folks in government affairs that cover all 30 plus states that we operate in, and are also responsible for other things like grant writing and things like that. But then each general manager at each of our individual properties, the person who's running the Grand Elk Railroad in Grand Rapids, they also do a good bit of community relations on their own. So for us, we try to not be a no automatically company and be a yes and or a yes with conditions sort of company. And we try and bring a team approach to this because, it may be me, it may be the GM at the local property. So we try to surround things collaboratively, but also that means that sometimes it can look hard to access us because it's not quite sure, which person where to find us. So, we do our best. We're a good size and we have a lot of team and we spend a lot of time trying to do this, but we can always do better. So if you ever need any contact information for our company or any of our railroads, feel free to go through me or our friends at GoRail. Like Larry, I am also a GoRail alum, so our friends at GoRail can help point you in the right direction as well.
We have the part of the gang back here for this call, so thank you all. And last but not least, Tom from CSX.
Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be on. My name is Tom Livingston. I'm the Vice President for Government and Community Affairs at CSX Transportation. I am sitting in our largest intermodal yard in suburban Chicago right now during our peak season. Like Kevin, I am a former elected official. I did 2 terms as a trustee in LaGrange, Illinois, and then retired from that and got pulled back in and did 2 terms as village president. I have about 150 trains, both passenger and freight, per day in LaGrange. So I am empathetic and sympathetic to making things work with local communities. I also serve on the board of the Indiana Railroad, which extends from Indianapolis down into southeastern Illinois, and the Baltimore and Ohio Chicago Terminal Railroad. The CSX is getting ready to celebrate its 200th birthday. We incorporate part of the old B&O and C&O network. We cover 2/3 of the U.S. population in terms of density and our network, and partner with all the railroads here on this call to move things through in what is our peak season right now as we sit here. So happy to be on this call, and I've been with CSX about 23 years, and prior to that did stints in state government, including transportation policy advisor for airports and rail and roads. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for joining us during peak season. Appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Brett for a question.
So the first question that we have is, many communities are looking to grow their economies by attracting rail-served industries or redeveloping underused industrial land. So this question is going to be for Kevin, Johan, and Larry. Can you share how your railroad works with site selectors, economic development agencies, EDCs, and local governments to ID and support these types of industrial development opportunities? We'll go ahead and start with Kevin. I've got you first on my piece of paper, so I'll start with you.
Look at me, just starting everything off here. So, as Tom Livingston mentioned, his railroad's about to celebrate 200 years. So our railroads have played active roles for hundreds of years of creating industrial development opportunities for local governments, for the state government, for the federal government. So it's something that we're well versed in and take a lot of pride in. And we're always looking to better attract business, better help our communities attract business. And from a CN perspective, ways we do that, first and probably most important, is proximity to active rail. It doesn't make sense to have a rail served site if there's no rail there. Projects are always more feasible when we're not looking to create operation constraints, safety risks, or having to spend excess capital to make a site rail ready or rail served. Second, land control and zoning are always important uses. Rail served and industrial sites need adequate space for truck circulation, and buffers from other neighboring properties. As my friend Larry mentioned, railroad operations can be messy, can be noisy, can be dirty. So the best way to do that is making sure there's enough buffer from an industrial site to neighboring commercial or industrial or residential properties. And finally, projects, they move more smoothly when there's alignment from the railroad, the local developer, the local government, or the economic development group that we're working with. One of the most important factors for success, and I think a common theme we'll hear, is engaging the railroad early. Early engagement's key. Local officials, our economic development partners, are best served when we're brought into the table or brought into these discussions at an early or concept stage. It helps us make sure that the site's compatible, make sure that we're able to serve the site. And it also gives everyone an opportunity to seek alternatives if it isn't a compatible use. So, I guess to just wrap up my piece here, when early coordination happens, railroads can be a strong partner, and we're always willing and wanting to help our communities attract economic businesses, industrial businesses, you name it. We're happy to do it. So turn it back over to Brett.
So Johan, I'm going to go ahead and throw you a live question because this does piggyback well off of what we're talking about. We had asked in the chat, how would one go about expanding a line that is underutilized to connect with a new facility to provide that rail use? I suppose I can also kind of follow up, say, not just expanding that line, what if there's also a closed line or an old line that maybe could be refurbished? How would y'all go about looking at that type of project?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brett. I think it begins with, and a lot of it is very specific to the location, right? What are the accesses? What are the how's the area populated? Is it by schools? Is it out in an industrial area? I mean, there's a lot of factors to look at, but in general, BNSF has an economic development team that's out looking at sites, working with shippers, working with industrial users, talking to local folks in the community to try to identify places that are really good for rail service. And then we also have a public projects team that works more on the local municipality side and helps local municipalities not only move their projects forward, but also get grants and federal funds and things like that. So in a situation like what you're describing, Brett, there would be a real team approach. We would bring in multiple people. We would look at it from a lot of different aspects. We would try to conceive of it from the kind of economic development, shippers, industrial development piece, but then also look at kind of the public resources that might be available to make that vision go forward. I'm intrigued by the term redeveloping underused industrial land, because out on the West Coast where I am, all land is at a premium, and particularly industrial land. And I think in cities like Seattle and Portland and even San Francisco, and probably Los Angeles the last few years, there's been this real focus on technology and moving technology and adapting more to that. And also housing is very expensive. So the industrial land that we have is under a lot of pressure. There really isn't any underutilized industrial land. I mean, it might be sitting right now waiting for an opportunity, but that land is incredibly important. And I think really the importance of that can be lost on a lot of people, because the industrial sector is where the resilience in a community happens. During COVID, that's where sanitizers were being produced. It's also some of the first infrastructure to recover after a major natural disaster, a flood or an earthquake or something like that. Rail is usually some of the first infrastructure to come back in there. So, you know, when communities are looking at kind of redeveloping what their community can be in the future, I'd strongly encourage you to consider industry and industrial areas and really protecting those, as opposed to trying to turn them into condominiums and dog parks, because man, once that industrial land is gone, you're never going to get it back, and it serves a real role in the community. We're there to help.
Thank you. And Larry, when the city is looking at a site or proposal, what makes it more viable from a railroad's perspective? And I think Kevin had alluded to this earlier as well, and it's best to engage early. I suppose I want to expand more on kind of the how can local officials best engage early in that process with a railroad?
Yeah, well, I mean, the early is the most critical part. And I would say one aspect I was thinking of as my colleagues were describing it is, I think one of the areas that we run into a lot, or I have at least in my history, is folks, when I say folks, local communities not understanding where they are on the rail network. So what I mean by that is it's really critical for you to understand, are you adjacent to a main line or are you adjacent to a branch line? And why that's critical is if you think of yourself, and we'll use the highway example, right? If you think of yourself and you wanted to build a house and you wanted to put it on the roadway, but you lived adjacent to the interstate, would the road authority let you just put your parking or your driveway right into the interstate, right? And the answer is no, they wouldn't. So you want to think about that in terms of a railroad. If you're adjacent to that main line and you're trying to develop an industrial piece there, from a railroad perspective, that's highly inefficient, right? Because you're going to have to do that. You could potentially have to do that switching operation right onto what is the equivalent of our interstate, and that's going to slow down and clog the whole network. So part of it would just be learning where you're at on the network, how the railroad views their network and views development opportunities on it is critically important. And again, we wouldn't necessarily expect you just to know that off the top of your head. A lot of that would come from engagement with folks on the GA side. We also have a business development people that are arranged geographically across the network. So we can always arrange meetings with you just to talk about it. And then I would say the other part that we haven't talked about yet for rail development is just transload opportunities again. And this is where we always kind of think, oh, if in order to use the railroad, I have to have a rail line going adjacent to a property, and that's the only way for me to use it. And in reality, if you can develop a transload site, which is basically where you could just put something on a truck that can then be moved onto a railhead, you could potentially not be directly on the rail line, but maybe you can truck it a mile down the road to get on a part of the rail network that the railroad does absolutely want to utilize, does want to put more tonnage on a particular underutilized route and take advantage of it that way. Now, certainly you also got to think about from local officials' perspective, well, what does that mean for increased truck traffic and everything, right? So you want to have that on truck specific routes and everything. But that's the other part I would really encourage everybody to be aware of is, hey, you don't just have to have that rail line coming right through it. I mean, we've got, just making me think of it out in southeast Iowa, we have really good relationships with like Ottumwa, Iowa, where they are looking at rail development, but not on the railroad. Some of it's 10 to 15 miles away from the railroad. But on a county level, they're looking at all their different rail connections and saying, okay, how do we take advantage of the 3 different class ones we have coming through here? And how do we market different areas for development that aren't just on the railroad, that specific railroad itself? So that's the other aspect I'd ask people to consider.
That's everything I had on industrial development. I'll pass the next question off to you.
Hey, Betsy, really quick, just to piggyback on kind of what Johan was speaking of, in Lake Orion, Michigan, Lake Orion Township, Michigan, GM's making a multi-billion-dollar investment into the GM plant, and a lot of that's driven by it's driven because they're building new cars, but CN has a large footprint nearby, property that was abandoned for 20 years, a rail line that was abandoned for 20 years. And we hear from other communities across the country saying, hey, you have this rail line you're not using, you have this property you're not using. We want to put 100 houses here. We want to put a Starbucks here. Where now they're getting a multi-billion-dollar auto manufacturing plant, good paying jobs, and they're able to do this with the support of rail. So it's I think a good example of underutilized industrial land that's now a success story that's being supported by rail.
Thank you. Those examples I think are really helpful. Yeah, so to sort of build off of that, our next sort of discussion area is how to get projects off the ground, right? So it's what Brett we're all alluding to, starting early, right? So whether it's a crossing improvement or a business park or other work, what are the key things railroads need to know early to avoid delays? And what does successful collaboration look like from the railroad side, like including maybe common missteps? So I will throw it to Cassie first.
Thanks, Betsy. I will say, my area is the public project side. We do work closely with the industrial development side if there's impact to any roadway infrastructure. But I will say our website has a lot of different contacts on which direction to head. But UP has developed what is called a contact center on our website, and it's pretty much all over the real estate and public projects area of the website, where you can add an inquiry to our system, and we can get Betsy that link to send out to everybody afterwards. And you can put any type of project in there, and we have a pretty quick turnaround time. I would say within a week, you should probably get contacted one way or the other. But as all of the folks in the previous question, Kevin, Johan, and Larry said, early communication is key in making sure that our goals are aligned, right? We want to operate a safe railroad. We want to be able to use our entire railroad for railroad operations, right? So we need to align what those goals are and set a feasible path forward early so that the project can go faster, right? So we don't want to just continually say no, 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 but tell you why right? This is our right of way. We're operating on it. We want to continue to operate on it for 150 to 200 years, right? As Kevin is ready to celebrate. So we just need to make sure to align our projects to make sure that it moves forward in the best path so that, you know, we can operate safely and you can function safely across or over our right of way.
All right. Johan, do you want to take that one as well? Kind of talking about some of the processes from your end that communities should be aware of in terms of timing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of the theme of the day is start early with the railroad. And Kevin said this, Cassie just reiterated. I think it's been emphasized about a half dozen times. So I'm going to say it a different way. Don't start late with the railroad. I'll get people will come to me, you know, after they've done engineering and design and they've talked to stakeholders and they've got this big plan, they've got all this stuff ready, and they'll say, you know, we're going to start Monday and all we need to do is get the railroad to sign off. And that conversation almost never goes well. It ends up being very time consuming and expensive. And really, I think that there's a lot of resources that railroads can bring if we're approached early on. First thing is BNSF publishes our own guide to public projects. It's on our website. Anybody can get it. And it talks about this is how you do a quiet zone. This is how you do a grade separation. It goes through kind of the main projects that folks might encounter in their communities. It kind of talks step by step about how to do that. So that's a good place to start. But also, my second point is that standardization is really important across the railroad, right? If you think about my particular railroad, we have 32,000 miles of track across 28 states. We go through hundreds, maybe thousands of local communities. So, you know, we want things that look mostly the same. And actually, we have a lot of experience doing this. You know, whatever project it is that your community is working on, there's a good chance we've probably worked on something like that. Maybe we've done dozens of them. Maybe we've done hundreds of them. And so by coming to the railroad early with some kind of an idea with some specificity of what it is that you want to do, we can be a resource to tell you, look, that's probably not going to work. This is probably something that might work. And we've got a lot of different versions of things like that that could be really helpful. An example would be in my state, Washington State, salmon habitat is a really big deal. And so we've been working with local tribes to remove culverts that serve as blockages for salmon and replacing those with bridges that are more fish friendly, fish can get through, and it opens up a lot of habitat. One of the benefits of the way that we approached that was that we know how to build a bridge. We've built bridges, we've got thousands of bridges on our network. So, you know, somebody might come in with like a really elaborate idea of what that structure would look like, and we could say, that's probably not going to work in this situation, but here's 5 examples of things that could, and it's actually been really successful. We've had a lot of great partnerships with area tribes and with environmental communities, which is kind of an interesting thing for a railroad on the West Coast. You don't always see those kind of alliances, but it really works well for us. So start early, don't start late. And as much as you can think in terms of standardization for plans, for planning, also for legal documents, maintenance agreements, and things like that, once lawyers start debating language on kind of the standard agreement, that can make projects go a lot longer and add a lot of cost. So start early, don't start late, and think, you know, try to think in terms of something that's more standard as opposed to the most elaborate design you can come up with, is my advice.
Thank you. Curtis, is there anything from a short line perspective to add to this discussion or question?
Yeah, I mean, a lot translates no matter the size or the location of the railroad. But I think both kind of Larry's point about context and you know, Johan's point about specificity are both important, right? You know, from a short line standpoint, you know, we have 47 railroads. There are 550 other short lines around the country. And you can think of us as, to use Larry's example, like we would be like the state and local roads of the network, right? So not much starts and ends on the same short line. We're either picking something up and handing it off to a class 1 or receiving it from a class 1 and delivering it. So if you're near a short line, just knowing that context is important as well, because in some cases, we own our railroad. And in some cases, we lease our railroad from one of the other railroads on this call. And that can make a difference in the standard we need to apply. Johan's specificity may be slightly different than what Kevin's team wants at CN in terms of bridges or highways or intersections, or amounts of clearing in different places, or the type of crossing project we do. So knowing that context is important. And then kind of the specificity of it is important as well, because what we will need depends on what type of project it is, right? Like if it's a crossing project, are we talking about a surface improvement because it's a little rough and people are complaining? Or are we talking about lights and gates? Is that a federally funded program that changes the type of process that we're going to go through and going to engage in? If it's a business opportunity, how real is it? Demonstrate what you're coming with. Is it, we've got this idea, we want to, there's land, we want to do something with it? Or is it, we have 3 companies in the community that are ready to, do business here right? Those are very different starting places. And just like every elected public official, whether you're at, the HOA level or in Congress, gets a lot of inbound on all sorts of things. And some of them are things you're excited about because they reflect shared priorities and things you can achieve. And some are just not, right? And railroads, we get a lot of inbound as well. And some of it is well thought out and stuff we're excited to engage in. And some of it is more, a guy had an idea. Those can be great. But the more that idea is developed and it's real and it's not, I think I want to create a pedestrian trail that goes over the railroad. Like, well, let's stop and think about that. We have a lot of, safety and operations are our reason for existing. And we all have our own kind of internal bureaucracies as well, just like the public side does. And so trying to think that through and recognize that we're all going to have to do some translating, I think, to each other is an important bit of context to know going into things, whether the road is small or quite big.
Thanks, Curtis. Anyone else want to add something on this? Okay. For the next topic, we kind of wanted to zero in on grants and federal grants, because I got a lot of questions about that. And I will just say that GoRail maintains our rail grant hub that has lots of good information about federal rail related grants. For example, the Rail Crossing Elimination Grant, the National Railroad Partnership Program, which is a passenger focused grant we just had a webinar on recently. Anyway, so lots of good resources there. I will drop the link in the chat. But then, for the panel, and I think this might be a reiteration of some of our discussion about starting early, but what can communities do to make their proposals, their grant proposals, more competitive from the start? And just again, understanding the railroad perspective on these grant projects. And so let's see, I'm going to throw that out to Tom first.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I think like everybody here, the greater the match, the local match, the better chance for grant success. Is it measurable? If we put this facility here, what is the economic output? The projects that pencil well for the railroad have a good rate of return. The projects that pencil well for the government have sort of a measurable economic output. Shovel ready is always good. A lot of municipalities and counties we've worked with, it's somewhat akin to the patient fisherman or woman who's sitting in the boat and they're casting and they're waiting. They've kept disciplined zoning for industrial. Johan mentioned that, and that has almost always paid off, and you're seeing a lot of storage. You're seeing a lot of cross dock. Transflow was mentioned earlier. You know, containerized traffic are growth points for the railroads. And so we're hungry to find those new networks. We probably had about 75 new projects along our railroad this year. Not huge, but just that's all the railroads are kind of hungry for that. Locating the new Honda plant is awesome, but it's once in a blue moon. So shovel ready match, you know, economic development story has been a good secret sauce for us. Or maybe
Whoops.
not so secret. I think everybody else does the same thing.
Thank you, Tom. Let's see. Cassie, would you like to speak to this a bit?
Well, on our grants, we do provide letters of support for projects, as Tom was noting, right, are see benefit to the railroad. And we also, you know, do 22905s, and we do an internal look to make sure that those are good projects. So I don't actually work on a lot of grants from my perspective, so I don't know if I have a lot of additional intel to share on that. But we do provide lots of letters of support for quite a bit of projects.
Got it. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay.
All right. And then Larry, any other additional thoughts there about working with communities on grants?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to the rinse and repeat, it's definitely the engagement early, but I would also say engagement early with an open mind. So I'm sitting right now at our yard in Bensonville, Illinois. Back behind me is the community of Franklin Park, Illinois. And I always highlight them as one of the best practice on the network because we had a significant block crossing issue in Franklin Park for many years. And it's the nature of railroading. They're a community that's right adjacent to the rail yard. So you're always going to have trains either slowing down to come into the yard or basically at a stop and trying to get up to speed to exit the yard. So you're always going to have a prolonged impact for that. And we had one particular crossing that was a friction point, and we sat down with the community, really focused on that crossing and worked to help them get a rail crossing elimination grant. But the reason I highlight that is it was that RC grant process that one of the things I love about the RC is it really asks you to take a corridor approach instead of just looking at a particular crossing. And what we loved about that is we had multiple crossings in Franklin Park that were impacted, and we were able to really look at 4 or 5 crossings together, and partly through the RCE process, but partly also outside of it. That discussion led to about 3 different separate efforts, proactive efforts we now have with Franklin Park. Some that will benefit us to some level, all of them will benefit the community of Franklin Park, whether from a safety standpoint or reduction of mitigation, a reduction of friction points that can be mitigated. And so really what I mean by that is hey, like if you have a particular crossing that's impacted, whether it's in terms of a quiet zone effort, occupied crossings, vegetation, I don't know, it could be a lot of different things. I would also say just engage the railroad and look at that whole part of the property of railroads that comes through your neighborhood and try and have a holistic approach. Because why that matters is to what a lot of other folks have said here, from a bandwidth standpoint, it might be if there's not a particular or huge benefit to the railroad on a particular crossing, just bandwidth wise, it might be hard for us to really engage on one particular crossing. But if you want to look at an extended period area and look at 3 or 4 issues at a time, it might be easier for us to leverage resources internally to get at that. And then also the ROI on that effort can have a much higher return, right? And so that then allows us to leverage more resources and think outside the box for it much more. So I would say that, like, don't just have the blinder approach on and just look at a particular issue. Try and expand and say, okay, maybe there's a laundry list of different things from occupied crossing, quiet zone, industrial development, real estate management. Like, can we talk about all those things and have that much longer conversation? Now, the other aspect of that is that does take more time, and that, maybe you have to have more patience to work through that. A lot of our conversations with Franklin Park we're getting close to entering into our second year of conversations on it. We haven't lost momentum. We haven't gone backwards, basically. We've maintained momentum, but sometimes there's been more momentum than other parts, right? So it's just really having that long view, and having that corridor-wide approach, I think, is really important for it in terms of grant applications, right? Of how can I get after more than one thing with one particular grant.
Thank you, Larry. Anyone else on that specific topic, grants? All right, moving on.
Okay, so our next question, I have this for Kevin, Curtis, and Tom. Now I'm going to go kind of in sequential order here because we're going to hit some of these topics, including one that's going off in the chat right now. Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the quiet zone process, which is administered by the Federal Railroad Administration, including the safety considerations around creating those zones and what that process looks like on the railroad side?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. And I saw Ashley's comment and a couple other comments in the chat, and was just trying to bring myself up to speed and saw some of the local newspaper coverage on the issue. And obviously, I think that one, there's 3 different railroads. There's a lot of coordination. Obviously, if it's a CN issue, we could do better. So if it is our issue, happy to talk offline with Ashley on that. But in response to your question, with us, our process involves coordinating with the state DOT, the local DOT, providing the safety numbers, the train numbers, all that good information. We help with the design standards to ensure they meet just not only the FRA standards for the crossing, but our own signal and crossing requirements. And then usually a question I get is, well, what's the railroad contributing financially? And a lot of times that's it's like an in-kind. Most of the time it's an in-kind donation where we're providing the engineering review, the design review on the crossing and signal maintenance. I still messed it up. Maintenance.
Curtis, you mentioned trails earlier, so I got to double back to you. What's the best way to approach a Rails to Trails project?
I think Rails to Trails, like quiet zones, are tricky. They take time, they take money. Many times we start with incentives that are not necessarily automatically aligned, right? And so I think just recognizing that there is a very specific process that we do not control, right? Whether it's quiet zone, there's a very specific FRA process you have to go through, right? Rails to Trails, it ends up involving a filing at the Surface Transportation Board about the specific rail corridor. And while, look, we're all people too, right? Like, we like pretty places. We don't like loud noises. As human beings, we want some of the same things that a lot of your constituents and you do. But that for the railroad, like, a horn is a safety device. And if there's any chance that rail will ever be used again, we're kind of loath to take a significant action to take it out of service. And I know that's frustrating. I get frustrated with it sometimes too. So I think for both, you have to start with a pretty just open conversation about why, time frame, funding, and recognizing that there's a federally proscribed process that is going to have to happen. I know a few folks from Ann Arbor had registered for this webinar, and we're engaged in a quiet zone process with the city of Arbor now. And it's taken a long time, right? And and it costs money, and it involves, we were there. I was there in January of last year, I believe, maybe late January, early February, and we're walking around in the snow in Ann Arbor. They provided a bus, so we didn't have to walk all the way across town. But you're getting out, you're looking at the crossing, you're looking specifically at this crossing. What does it need? If there weren't a horn here to blow to alert people of the presence of a train, what other measures need to be taken? And even then, when you're done with the quiet zone, like if there's a person on the track, we're still going to blow the horn, right? Because while we have an excellent safety story to tell overall, and we're happy that fatalities and near misses and all of those things are down dramatically, they still exist, and we want them to get to zero, right? So I guess for these two types of projects in particular, these can be tricky and they can take a while and they can be expensive. And so I don't think there's a magic secret sauce on either of them other than, you know, we just all have to roll up our sleeves and get there. You know, for us, we're large enough that we do have a real estate team, we do have a public projects team, we do have an engineering team that can help overcome those challenges, but a lot of short lines won't necessarily have that either. So that's going to be kind of a missing piece of the puzzle that collectively we'll have to solve. And that often involves funding from the municipality because, you know, most short lines aren't running with a whole lot of extra, you know, just an extra lot of profit sitting around. And we like to put money in our track and in keeping our operations moving smoothly and to keep getting safer. So those two types of projects in particular are tricky. They happen all the time, right? I don't mean to be discouraging, but I do want to be realistic that those are just tricky, and there's a federal process involved in that, and we're just all going to have to roll up our sleeves and work pretty hard on those.
Quick follow-up on that, Curtis. Is there a substantial difference approaching a quiet zone or a rails to trails between short lines and class ones?
I wouldn't think that our approach would really vary all that much. We just may not have as many people internally to ask questions to or to guide through the process. You know, like as I say, we're really large in short line world, right? But nowhere near as large as a class one. And even class ones have finite resources, right? And our engineering team exists to preserve our track and to upgrade our track and to, you know, design, you know, rail replacements and make curves safer and do things like this. So involving them in another project, there is a bit of an opportunity cost there, but we're happy to do it. I think a lot of short lines are not going to have those resources in-house. So I don't think the approach would be that different, but the resources that they would be able to commit would probably be pretty significant. And that's where sometimes your state rail office at your state DOT or, you know, some of your MPOs have more sophisticated consultants or engineers on staff that can help with that as well. There's always another resource. It just adds a layer of work to the process.
Tom, I kind of want to piggyback off of both this quiet zone discussion and the rails to trails discussion, along with a lot of what I'm seeing in the chat, which is a concern about maintaining rights of way and the track itself, whether that's vegetation. I have had this come up in my own conversations out in the field with encampments near y'all's property, not y'all's, just the rail industry in general, and these different types of issues with like rough crossings. What is the best way for local officials to get in contact about these issues that maybe are not large scale industrial development projects or anything along those lines, but issues that are going to maybe on a day-to-day basis impact their communities?
Yes, well, I think that's usually a 1-2 punch. One is all the railroads generally have a kind of a hotline, and I'm happy to put ours in. And that creates a record. Once you call in an issue, it gets spit out to engineering, government affairs, the law department. And the second one too is to reach out to your community affairs person. You know, any number of days during the week, I'm out on the railroad, my team is, and we are looking over the same patient, if you will. I want to manage expectations. You know, CSX has 21,000 miles of track. So we, you know, we can't maintain it ourselves along the way. You know, we have interstate commerce. It's all we can do to get the goods going on time. But, you know, I think we've done good jobs with like inland ports where we create, I think Kevin mentioned buffer zones and things like that we've gotten smarter as municipalities and as railroads over the years to know what works and what doesn't. And the rest of it is we just try our best. You know, we're measured by our dwell, how long we're sitting in the yards, and our velocity, how fast we're going on the network. And so we are as unhappy when we're stopped, when we're causing a problem or cutting a town in two. I saw some chats on that. Right away is kind of a in LaGrange, the public works, we did the right away, you know. BNSF does some of it, but it's a shared partnership depending on the situation. So we are very sensitive about right away, you know. Well, anyway, we'll go into that, I think, in another question, but you know, it's a 1-2 punch.
Thank you. I think that's all I have on some of these kind of day-to-day and these local project questions. So Betsy, I will hand it off to you for the next set.
Thanks, Brett. I realized I skipped one that is maybe what Tom was alluding to just now. And that's the conversation about broadband. Lots of states are building out broadband infrastructure, and coordinating with railroads is becoming more important. Could you speak to how and why that coordination matters for railroads and communities? And I'd throw that out to maybe, well, if any takers, but I was going to say Curtis first, because I see you nodding.
Well, I'm nodding because, you know, not to pick on the state of Michigan, but Michigan's gotten a great amount of money to expand rural broadband, and that's a pretty exciting thing. And they've gotten approval to actually spend the money now, right? The sites have been selected. It's time to go. And, you know, as people who, all of our team members live in those communities, we're excited about it as well. But it does sometimes lead to some confusion around things. You know, as Tom mentioned, we can be a little tricky, a little prickly about our right of way sometimes, right? Because it is private property that is privately owned, and that we're trying to both maintain its physical condition of and maintain the safety of, right? And for anyone who happens to cross the track, but also for our train crew who are there every day moving things that we all depend on. And you know, I know one of our railroads, for example, has had folks just kind of show up on property, start boring underneath the railroad without any notice, cut a signal wire, and now literally the you know, the crossing gate and the flashing lights that we all depend on in safety aren't functioning anymore, right? Because of this. And you know, I don't think they had ill will in their hearts. I don't think they're bad people. But when we don't all coordinate this appropriately, things can get unsafe pretty quickly. And so every single one of our companies has a process for approving requests to go through the right of way. To do that, you know, we use one company across all of our properties to do that for us, and then we have a couple internal people that monitor them. I will say that kind of going up to what do we need to know, you know, that question from before, like we have an application, and completeness of information is very important. Almost every time that we see a delay in the process where we're not meeting a 30-day window or something like that is because there's been a missing piece of information, or just the communication has died somewhere along the way. I'm happy to say that in Michigan, you know, the state broadband office is actively trying to facilitate that cooperation. I know it's not always perfect, but they're trying. And you know, every one of our companies has put a lot of time into trying improving our process in recent years. So particularly for broadband, I know it's a thing. I know it's probably going to be more of a thing soon. But we have a process in place. It's for safety, and we want to get applications expedited as quickly as we possibly can as well.
That's helpful. Anyone else want to speak to the broadband?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, sometimes it's a reputational thing. However, the railroads are very supportive of broadband. We helped, and it's a little corny, but going back to the telegraph, we brought that technology to scale, you know, 200 years ago, and you go on and on and on from there to the fiber optic networks that were spawned during that time. So sometimes I think it's a false choice, either broadband or railroad, and really we have been very supportive of the coexistence of that, the implementation of that. We just, as Curtis said, need to make sure everybody's protected. And, I think we're all in a better place on broadband. As long as everybody's following each other's rules, we can be pretty quick about it.
Thanks, Tom. All right, so I'm just going to move to sort of our last a few minutes left. I think we've done our best to answer questions along the way, so I'm not sure if we'll get to additional questions, but we have them if they're in the chat, and we'll follow up individually as necessary. And then we also plan to provide a list of resources, the contacts that are that folks have shared in the chat. So if you don't gather them here, I will send them to you. But so, finally, we're looking ahead to the next surface transportation reauthorization. And freight rail is uniquely positioned to deliver public benefits like lower emissions, fewer trucks on the road, less wear and tear on publicly funded roadways. So how can local leaders be better partners and advocates, not only in their own projects, but in telling the broader story about rail? Let's see. I'm gonna pick on Johan for this one.
Great, thank you. Well, I think, and if people haven't caught this, or maybe you came in late, theme of the day is communicate early and often. That just always resonates in anything. I think too, in kind of thinking about like community development and what it is that you're trying to achieve and what it is that you want to do, what are your goals? It's important to think in terms of infrastructure and what's the best use of the infrastructure, right? Different modes are good at really good things, different things. Railroads are excellent for moving big, heavy things really long distances. So if you want to move coal or soybeans or 1 million containers full of holiday gifts, rail is probably a really good mode to do that on. If you want to move a couple hundred things to the next community over, probably put it on a truck. So let's think in terms of like maximizing the benefit of those modes when we're thinking about our urban development. That can be, I think, a really helpful suggestion. Sometimes people will approach and they'll say, hey, we want to get a passenger train that goes to the other side of the state because once a year, my wife and I want to go over there and sip wine and have kind of a romantic weekend and then come back again. My response to that is, okay, well, you just sold 2 tickets on a piece of infrastructure that is incredibly capital intensive and takes a lot. And so probably not the best use of that infrastructure. I think that's an important piece. It was interesting in the broadband conversation. We have a lot of technology on our own lines. We have our own telecommunications departments. And so part of that consideration, the safety that Curtis was talking about, is ensuring that stuff that we're putting out there in the right of way doesn't conflict with our own technology gear, because we're a technology company. We have sensors, every 10, 15, 20 miles along our tracks. So we don't want things that are in conflict with that. But we also are companies that trace our lineage back 150 years in most cases, probably longer than that. So we think in terms of decades and centuries as opposed to year over year. And if we're making changes, we want to make sure that they're going to be durable for the long run. Last thing that I would mention is I serve on several grant boards regionally. And the projects that tend to get funded are the ones that meet the most multiple needs, right? The best project reduces congestion and it takes trucks off the road and it moves trucks from publicly funded roads and highways to privately funded railroads. And it reduces emissions and it helps move traffic around a community and get kids to school more safely. It doesn't have to be a big project. It doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive project, but if it's meeting multiple diverse needs, those tend to compete really well. So start early, communicate early and often. Think about what's the best use of the infrastructure, what's the best use of the infrastructure over the long term for the next 50 or 100 years. And then as much as you can, try to build really diverse coalitions around your projects that bring more people to the table and create many, many benefits. Last thing I would just say in closing is our public projects team. I saw some questions in the chat. Our public projects team is online. You can find their contact information there. I invite you to take a look around bnsf.com, and look at our public projects manual and then reach out to our public projects folks if you have questions about projects moving forward.
Thanks so much. So yeah, I mean, I guess just any final thoughts? You could throw it out to really anyone since this is our last discussion prompt.
Yeah, Betsy, I'll build on it real quick, particularly folks like Tom and I that do federal government affairs. You asked about how to be better partners. We're entering surface reauthorization time in DC when all the federal transportation funding is going to come up for renewal. And certainly all these grant programs that we talked about are going to be on the block either for more money or the chopping block for less money. So I would say being engaged with your members of Congress, your delegation, talking about how important that grant funding is. Some of it is for very local projects. Some of it, like Chrissy grants, are very important for potential grade separations, but also use of the rail network as well, whether it's short lines or folks developing their rail assets more. So that would be my final plea to everybody is be active during the surface reauthorization discussion that's going to go on for the next 9 months or so and advocate for those grant programs.
Thanks, Larry.
It's building on that too. Like, I think we would all be remiss if we didn't point out the fact that we're on a webinar hosted by GoRail in partnership with NLC and involving local public officials, right? And so even though, yeah, Larry and I used to work at GoRail, so this is self-serving, I guess, but GoRail's done a really great job in the last few years of pointing out those grant opportunities, of bringing issues affecting rail back to the communities and getting communities involved in advocacy in DC. And that is a good trend, and we want that to continue to happen because the more we all interact, the better we're going to realize that we're all people and we're trying to get through this and we can roll up our sleeves and work on it together. One pretty direct way of how can you better support stronger rail in policy development is stay engaged with GoRail. And if they alert you to a rail policy issue, it's probably a good one. It means that all the railroads have agreed on it, right? You're not getting involved in a war among the railroads or anything like that, that it really is a policy issue that affects us all, and that we would appreciate your help on it. So I thank you for joining and for also being involved in GoRail.
Well, gosh, that's a pretty good concluding thought. Anyone else? No. Okay. Well, thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and thanks to the National League of Cities for partnering on this webinar. And thank you also to GoRail President Michael Gaynor. As we heard, building strong relationships early, being clear, collaborative, proactive, those are all things that can make a difference in ensuring your projects move forward. Please visit our Rail Grant Hub. I dropped that link in the chat. On the note of quiet zones, we held a webinar earlier this year with the National League of Cities as well on quiet zones. So you can find that on our YouTube page. I can drop that in the chat. And then just, looking ahead to surface transportation, as Curtis said, we would love it if you stay engaged on those issues that we are advocating for. And this concludes our session. Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Betsy. Happy holidays.